The day Harlan Rourke rode into Caldwell, Kansas, he had $43 to his name, a horse that was half lame, and a warning from the last town's barkeep still ringing in his ears, that the woman who ran the Dawson homestead on the eastern flats was harder to kill than the prairie wind, and that any man who tried to partner with her had best be ready to work himself into an early grave. Harlan had listened to all of that, set down his whiskey glass, and said, with the kind of quiet certainty that made men stop talking and start listening, that sounded exactly like the kind of woman he had been looking for his whole life. It was 1878, and the Kansas plains were no place for the faint-hearted. The cattle drives were shifting. The railroad had come through 2 years prior and changed everything about how a man could make money, and the Homestead Acts had brought wave after wave of settlers who were now either flourishing or dying in slow, quiet ways that the land kept as its own secret. Caldwell itself sat on the edge of the Kishom Trail, a town that smelled of cattle and sawdust and whiskey, where the storefronts had false fronts meant to make them look taller than they were, and where the hotel charged $1 a night and didn't ask questions. Harlan Rourke was 31 years old, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of river water on a cloudy day, somewhere between gray and blue, shifting depending on the light. He had worked cattle drives from Texas to Nebraska, had spent 2 winters trapping in Colorado, had tried his hand at silver mining outside of Leadville, and come away with nothing but a deep, abiding respect for men who did that work, because he himself had not lasted 4 months. He was not a man who gave up easily, but he was a man who knew his limits, and underground living was one of them. What he wanted, what had been growing in him like a slow-burning ember for the better part of 3 years, was land. Not borrowed land, not worked land, not land he tended for somebody else's profit. His own land. A place where he could sink roots so deep that nothing could pull them loose. He had watched other men do it, watched them struggle and bleed for it, and he had decided that struggling and bleeding for something that was actually yours was infinitely better than doing it for someone else's paycheck. The barkeep's name was Monroe, a wide man with a gray beard and the kind of eyes that had seen enough of everything to find most things unremarkable. He had told Harlan about Susan Dawson the way a man might warn another man about a stretch of road, not to discourage travel exactly, but to make sure the traveler knew what he was getting into. Susan Dawson had come to Kansas 6 years prior with her husband, a man named Thomas Dawson, who by all accounts had been a decent enough fellow with big dreams and a constitution that was not quite equal to the Kansas climate. Thomas had died of fever in their 3rd winter, leaving Susan with 160 acres, a half-built house, 2 plow horses, and a daughter who was not yet 2 years old. And instead of doing what most women would have done, returning east, remarrying quickly, or selling the land to a neighbor, Susan Dawson had stayed. She had finished building the house herself, with help from a neighboring family named Prout, and a hired hand she had paid in meals and board for 3 months. She had broken ground, planted corn and wheat, had traded and bartered and negotiated with the same cattlemen and merchants that most homesteaders found themselves at the mercy of, and she had done it all so effectively that by 1878, her farm was one of the more productive operations on the eastern flats. She ran 30 head of cattle, had a kitchen garden that supplied half the households in a 5-mile radius during growing season, and had a reputation for being able to repair just about any piece of farm equipment that was brought to her with a rueful shrug and a broken part. She was 28 years old. She had a daughter named Clara, who was 7, with her mother's directness and her late father's brown eyes. And she had, by Monroe's accounting, turned down no fewer than 3 serious proposals of marriage in the past 4 years, each from men who had come to her with what they thought were excellent offers, and had left with a polite refusal, and apparently a distinct sense that they had somehow failed an examination they had not known they were sitting. Monroe had told Harlan all of this, and then looked at him the way a man looks at another man he considers probably too optimistic for his own good. Harlan had tipped his hat, finished his drink, and asked for directions to the Dawson homestead. The ride out was about 4 miles east of town, on a road that was really more of a well-worn track through the tall grass. It was late September, and the Kansas plains had that particular amber gold quality they took on in autumn, the grass bending in long waves under a wind that carried the first suggestion of cold in it. The sky was enormous overhead, the kind of sky that made a man feel simultaneously very small and very free, and Harlan rode through it with his coat collar turned up and his mind turning over what he was going to say when he got there. He had not rehearsed anything. Harlan Rourke was not a rehearsing sort of man. He believed that the right words came when you were standing in the moment and paying attention, and that anything prepared in advance had a kind of falseness to it that people could smell the way they could smell rain coming. What he was proposing, what he intended to propose, if the woman was agreeable to hearing him out, was a business arrangement of a practical and straightforward nature. He had skills. He had experience with cattle, with horses, with the kind of large-scale farm management that came from years of watching operations succeed and fail across 3 states. He did not have money, but he had his labor, and he was willing to sign whatever agreement seemed fair. He wanted a stake in land. She had land and needed hands. It seemed to him like the beginning of a logical conversation. He had not accounted for the fact that the first thing he would see when he rounded the last bend in the road was Susan Dawson herself, standing in the bed of a farm wagon with a wrench in one hand and her hair coming loose from its pins, arguing with a piece of machinery that had clearly gotten the better of her morning. She was not what he had pictured. Monroe's description had given him something severe in his imagination, something weathered and angular and forbidding. What he saw instead was a woman who was angry in a very specific technical way, the kind of anger that was really just intense focus wearing a sharper expression than usual. She was medium height, with a figure that farm work had made strong and capable rather than slight. Her hair was dark brown and was losing its battle with the wind. She had flour on her sleeve and grease on her left hand, and she was muttering something under her breath that was probably not appropriate for polite company. She looked up when she heard his horse, and the expression on her face did not shift toward welcome. It shifted toward assessment. "You lost," she said, not unkindly but not warmly either, plainly. "No, ma'am," Harlan said. He stopped his horse at a reasonable distance and took his hat off. "If you're Susan Dawson, I was looking for you specifically." She studied him for a moment with dark eyes that were very direct and very intelligent. "Who told you where to find me?" "Monroe, at the saloon in town. He mentioned you might be looking for experienced help. I'm here about that." "Monroe said that, did he?" It was not quite a question. She looked back at the piece of machinery she was wrestling with, made one more adjustment with the wrench, and then stepped down from the wagon bed with the easy economy of movement of someone who climbed in and out of wagon beds several times a day. She wiped her greasy hand on a cloth she pulled from her apron pocket and looked at him again. "What's your name?" "Harlan Rourke." "Where are you from?" "Harlan Rourke. Originally Texas, lately Colorado, before that Nebraska. You've moved around a considerable amount." "I have," he agreed, because there was no point in arguing with the truth. "I'm looking to stop moving." Something in her expression shifted by a fraction of a degree, but she did not comment on that. "Can you drive a team?" "Yes, ma'am." "Can you fix a seed drill that's got a cracked frame and a jammed feed tube?" "I'd need to look at it, but probably yes." She turned and looked at the machine in the wagon bed and then looked back at him. "Get down, then." He got down. He handed her the reins of his horse without being asked, which was either presumptuous or practical, depending on how you looked at it. She looked at him, looked at the horse, and tied the reins to the wagon wheel with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone who did not waste motion. Then she stepped aside so he could look at the seed drill. He looked at it for about 2 minutes, turning it over in his mind, tracing the crack in the frame with one finger, working the feed tube mechanism back and forth until he found where it was catching. "You've got a piece of grit lodged in the feed mechanism here," he said, "and this crack in the frame can be welded. You'd need a blacksmith for the weld, but you've got enough structural integrity to use it once more before it fails completely if you're careful." "I have a blacksmith coming on Thursday," she said. "Then you can finish your autumn planting before he comes if you want to risk it." She looked at him for a long moment. Not the way a woman looks at a man she's interested in. Not yet, nothing so simple as that. The way a person looks at a calculation they are trying to work out. He met her gaze steadily, which seemed to matter to her, because her expression settled into something slightly less neutral. "You'd best come inside," she said. "I'll hear what you have to say." The house was clean and functional, and had the particular character of a space that had been organized entirely by a woman with no patience for disorder and an instinct for efficiency. Everything had a place, and everything was in it, except for a child's rag doll sitting on the kitchen table and a half-finished piece of mending on the chair nearest the window. There was a smell of bread that had been baked that morning, and coffee that was still on the stove. Susan Dawson poured 2 cups of coffee without asking if he wanted one, set his on the table in front of the chair she gestured him toward, and sat across from him with her own cup and the direct, attentive expression of someone conducting an interview. He told her his situation plainly. He did not exaggerate his savings, which were small. He did not minimize his skills, which were considerable. He told her about the cattle drives, the trapping years, the failed mining venture. He included that last one because he thought leaving it out would be dishonest, and because he thought she was the kind of woman who would find out anyway and would think less of him for having concealed it. He told her that he wanted land, that he was willing to work for a fair stake in it, and that he was not interested in a situation that put either party at a disadvantage. She listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, turning her coffee cup in her hands. "3 men have proposed to me in the last 4 years," she said, "and before you say anything, I'm not telling you that because I think that's what you're here to do. I'm telling you because the reason I turned them down is relevant to what you're proposing." She paused. "Every one of them wanted to come in and take over. They said they wanted to help, but what they meant was they wanted to run things. My land, my decisions, my farm, they saw it as something to be managed by a man, and I was to be accommodated in that process rather than the other way around." "That's not what I'm proposing," Harlan said. "No," she said, "but I don't know that yet. You've told me what you want. I need to know how you intend to conduct yourself when you're working on land that is mine and decisions that are mine to make." "Same as I'd conduct myself working for anyone whose judgment I respect," he said. "I'd tell you what I think because I'm not a man who keeps useful opinions to himself, but what you decide stands." "It's your place." She studied him for another moment. "You said you're looking to stop moving. What does that mean exactly in terms of what you expect from this arrangement?" "It means I'd like to eventually have a piece of land I can call mine. I'm not asking for yours, but I'm hoping that if I work well and prove my worth, there might be an opportunity purchased fair and square with money I earned from my own parcel. Adjacent, maybe, if land comes available, or elsewhere if it doesn't." "That's an honest answer," she said. "I try to give those." She stood up and went to the window and looked out at her fields for a moment, and then she turned around. "I'll give you a trial period. 6 weeks. I'll pay you in board and $10 a month. If at the end of 6 weeks we're both satisfied with the arrangement, we'll discuss longer terms. If either of us is not satisfied, you go your way with no hard feelings and 12 weeks' worth of references in writing." "That's fair," he said. "There's a bunk in the barn," she said. "It's clean. I had a hand last spring who was tidy and I insist on it." "Yes, ma'am." "And," she said, with a look that was absolutely serious, "my daughter is 7 years old. I won't have her confused or upset by any behavior that is inappropriate for the situation. You're a hired hand. That is the only nature of this arrangement." "Understood," Harlan said, and he meant it entirely. He moved his few belongings into the barn bunk that afternoon, saw to his horse, and went back to find Susan already at the seed drill again, having pulled it from the wagon to the clear flat ground beside the barn. He worked beside her for the rest of the afternoon, and they spoke very little, the way two people who are figuring each other out sometimes go quiet and let the work speak for them instead. He learned a great deal about Susan Dawson in those first hours. She worked with a precision that he respected. She knew her equipment with the intimacy of someone who had repaired everything herself and understood how each piece functioned. She did not ask for his opinion, but she accepted it without resentment when he offered it, and twice she incorporated his suggestion without comment, which was its own form of acknowledgement. She was not warm, not yet, but she was fair, and in his experience, fair was considerably more valuable than warm in a working relationship. Her daughter Clara appeared at supper time, coming through the door in a rush of energy and immediately stopping dead when she saw Harlan washing his hands at the basin near the back door. Clara was 7 with dark eyes like her mother and a frank, unguarded quality to her expression that was entirely her own. She looked at Harlan with the directness of a child who had not yet learned to soften her assessments. "Who are you?" she asked. "Harlan Rourke. I'm going to be helping your mother on the farm for a while." Clara considered this. "Can you ride fast, reasonably fast?" Our last hand could not ride fast at all. His horse didn't like him. "My horse likes me well enough," Harlan said. Clara nodded, apparently satisfied with this answer, and went to wash her own hands. Susan, who had come in behind Clara and had been watching this exchange from the doorway, said nothing, but there was something very slightly less controlled about the set of her mouth, the ghost of an amusement she was not yet allowing herself. The first week passed in the way that good working weeks do, with a rhythm that builds itself naturally out of the requirements of the land and the day. Harlan was up before dawn, because that was when the work started, and he learned quickly that Susan was always up before him. A detail he found both impressive and faintly competitive in a way he chose not to examine too closely. He finished the repair on the seed drill with enough care that it held through the final autumn planting, which they completed in 4 days of sustained heavy work. He rehung a barn door that had been listing badly. He diagnosed a problem with one of the plow horses, a stone bruise on the left fore that had been causing a subtle unevenness in her gait, and showed Susan how to poultice it, and gave the mare 4 days of light work while it healed. He drove the wagon to town twice for supplies and returned with everything on the list and the correct change, which Susan verified without apology and he handed over without offense. At the end of the first week, Susan said, "You know horses. I've worked with them most of my life. Thomas, my husband, he knew cattle better than horses. We had some problems with the horses in those first years that I had to work out by myself mostly." It was the first time she had mentioned Thomas in any personal way, and Harlan recognized it for what it was, not an opening, not an invitation, just a fact she had decided to share, a small act of context. He received it as such. "Must have been hard," he said, "working it out with a young child and no one who knew horses nearby." "It was," she said simply, "but we managed. You more than managed from what I can see." She looked at him, and for a moment there was something unguarded in her expression, something that surprised her, he thought, as much as it might have surprised anyone. Then she picked up her gloves from the fence rail and put them back on and said that if the weather held, they might get the last of the kitchen garden in before the first hard frost, and the moment passed. But it had been there. He had seen it. The second week, the blacksmith came on Thursday as expected, a big red-faced man named Hargrove, who fixed the seed drill frame in 2 hours and spent the next hour drinking Susan's coffee and telling Harlan about the various disasters and near-disasters that had befallen the homesteads in the county that season. A family named Whitfield had lost half their winter wheat to a fungal blight. The Jarvis brothers, who ran cattle on the northern flats, had a dispute going with a large cattle operation out of Texas over grazing rights on a stretch of unfenced land, and the dispute had gotten heated enough that the county sheriff had been called out twice. And a man named Pete Doyle, who owned a good piece of land to the west of Susan's, was apparently in financial trouble serious enough that he might be forced to sell. Harlan listened to all of this carefully. When Hargrove left, he went looking for Susan, who was in the kitchen garden, and told her what Hargrove had said about the Doyle land. She straightened up slowly from where she was kneeling and looked at him. "Why are you telling me that?" she asked. "Because it's adjacent to yours on the west side, and if it comes up for sale, you might want to be first to know about it. Or," he added, watching her face, "I might." She looked at him for a moment with that particular measuring quality. "You've been here 10 days. Yes, but I've been thinking about this kind of thing for 3 years, so the speed is maybe misleading." There was a pause, and then something in her expression shifted, not softened exactly, but opened slightly, the way a window opens when someone decides the air outside is better than the air in. "Let me think about the Doyle land," she said. "Of course." "And Harlan," she said, and he noticed that she had started using his given name somewhere in the second week, without announcement, which he thought was probably significant. "If we're both looking at that land, we'd need to decide very clearly what the arrangement would be." "We would," he agreed. "There'd be time for that conversation." "Yes," she said, "there would be." The third week brought rain, and rain brought a different kind of work, indoor work, repair work, the kind of work that put two people in close proximity for longer stretches of time. They spent a day and a half repairing harness leather, sitting at the workbench in the barn with the rain drumming steadily on the roof, and they talked more in those hours than they had in the preceding 2 weeks combined. He learned that she had grown up in Ohio, in a family that had not been poor but had not been comfortable either, and that she had married Thomas Dawson at 22 after knowing him for a year, because he had seemed like a man with direction and the courage to pursue it. She had not been wrong about that, she said, with a care to her fairness that Harlan found moving. Thomas had had both those qualities. He had also had lungs that were not strong, and the Kansas winters had proved too much for him in the end. She said this without excessive grief. The grief had been spent years ago, and what remained was a clear-eyed, honest assessment of the facts of her life. He told her about growing up in Central Texas, on a ranch that had belonged to his father's employer rather than his father, which had been the particular frustration of his entire childhood. His father had been a good hand, a reliable hand, and he had given his working life to land that was never going to be his, and Harlan had decided before he was 15 that that particular pattern was not going to be his own. "Is that why you've moved so much?" she asked. "Looking for the right place to put down your own roots?" "Partly," he said. "Partly just learning. You don't know what you need from land until you've tried several different versions of it." "What have you learned?" she asked, and it was a genuine question, not a challenge, the kind of question a person asks when they are actually interested in the answer. "I've learned I need space," he said. "Not wild space, worked space. Land that responds to what you put into it. I've learned I can't work underground or in very tight quarters, which eliminated the mining pretty conclusively. I've learned I'm better with animals than most people I've worked alongside, and that's actually a skill worth building on. And I've learned that I work best when I care about the outcome, when there's a stake in it that's personal rather than just financial." She was quiet for a moment, working the leather in her hands. "You should have found your land years ago, by that accounting." "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe I needed to be ready for the right situation when it came." She looked up from the harness and met his eyes, and this time neither of them looked away for a beat longer than was strictly practical. Then Clara came running into the barn with a question about supper, and the moment dissolved, but it left something behind it, a warmth, a subtle shift in the air between them, like the first suggestion of a change in season. In the evenings, if the day's work was done at a reasonable hour, Harlan had taken to sitting on the front step of the house while Susan put Clara to bed, and more often than not Susan would come out afterward and sit in the chair she kept near the door, and they would talk in the blue evening air. These conversations were not about work. They were about the sort of things that people talk about when they are taking the measure of each other's interior life opinions, memories, small observations about the world. She was, he discovered, fiercely intelligent in a way that had not had much formal outlet. She had read everything she could get her hands on since childhood: history, natural science, whatever novels found their way to rural Kansas. And she had opinions about all of it that were clear and well-reasoned and occasionally startling in their originality. She talked about the injustice of the land policies that had displaced the native people of the plains with a directness that surprised him, not because he disagreed, but because it was not a subject that most homesteaders discussed with any comfort, given that they were the direct beneficiaries of those policies. Susan had no comfort with hypocrisy, and she named the contradiction plainly and without defensiveness, which he found remarkable. She asked him once during one of those evenings whether he felt any guilt about it. "I do," he said after a moment. "Not guilt that stops me from wanting my own land because the need is real and the situation is already what it is. But yes. The Cheyenne and the Arapaho were pushed from this country by force, and the farms were all benefiting from sit on that history. Acknowledging it doesn't fix it, but pretending it's not there seems like a way of making yourself smaller as a person." She looked at him for a long moment in the evening light. "Thomas never talked about it," she said. "He wasn't a bad man, but that particular thing made him uncomfortable. Most people it makes uncomfortable." "It should make people uncomfortable," Harlan said. "That's rather the point." She nodded slowly and turned her face back to the open plain. The last light was washing the grass gold and the sky above it deep amber, and the wind had gone quiet the way it sometimes did at the end of a September day, as if the land itself was taking a breath. Harlan watched Susan's profile in that light and felt something in his chest that he recognized but did not yet name, because naming it felt premature, and he was a man who did not like to rush important things. The 6th week, the final week of the trial period, arrived with a hard frost on Monday morning that killed the last of the kitchen garden and reminded the entire plains that winter was a serious and approaching thing. Harlan spent most of that week preparing the farm for cold weather, insulating the barn, checking the roof on the house for gaps, stacking the winter wood supply to Susan's very specific organizational system, which he had learned to respect without question, because it had a logic to it that became clear once you understood it. On the Thursday of that week, Pete Doyle came by. He was a thin, worried-looking man in his 40s, with the expression of someone who has been carrying a weight for a long time, and is only now beginning to consider setting it down. He came to the front door and asked for Susan, and Harlan was mending fence on the south side of the property when he rode up, close enough to see but too far to hear. He watched Susan come to the door and talk to Doyle for a few minutes. He saw the way she stood straight, attentive, not unfriendly but not giving anything away, and he saw Doyle hand her a folded piece of paper before he left. She brought the paper to him that evening. "Doyle's selling," she said. 40 acres on the western boundary. He's asking $120 for it." She handed him the paper, which had the details written in Doyle's careful, slightly unpracticed hand. "I can afford 60. "That leaves 60 short." Harlan looked at the paper for a long moment. "I have $43, he said. "I've been saving since I was 17, and $43 is what I have to show for it, which is either a testament to my poor financial judgment or an indication of how difficult it is to save money when you're working on other people's land." She almost smiled at that. "That's $103 between us. 17 short. I can negotiate with Doyle," she said. "Or the bank might extend credit on the difference. I have a good account there." There was a pause. They both knew what they were discussing was larger than 40 acres of land. The question of how the land would be held, who it would belong to, what the arrangement meant for the two of them going forward, all of that was present in the room without being stated. "The trial period ends Sunday," Susan said. "It does. I'd like to discuss longer terms." "So would I," Harlan said, and the steadiness in his voice surprised even him. She looked at him for a long, careful moment. The lamplight in the kitchen turned everything amber and close, and Clara was asleep, and outside the wind was doing what the wind always did on the Kansas plains, which was everything at once. "I don't do things quickly," she said. "I want you to understand that. I am not a woman who makes decisions from impulse, and I don't apologize for that." "I wouldn't want you to," he said. "But I also don't waste time being afraid of things that are actually good," she said, with a deliberateness that told him she had thought carefully about how to say exactly this. "Thomas was a good man, and losing him was one of the hardest things I've ever endured, and I've endured some very hard things. That's not a reason to avoid building something with someone who might be worth building with. It's a reason to be careful and honest about it." "That seems like the exact right way to think about it," Harlan said, very quietly. "Are you a patient man?" she asked. "With things that matter, yes." She looked at him for another long moment. Then she said, "Good. Then we'll renegotiate the terms of your employment on Sunday, and we'll talk about the Doyle land, and we'll see where we are." It was not a declaration. It was a beginning, careful and honest, and built on the kind of mutual regard that Harlan trusted far more than he would ever trust passion that arrived without foundation. He walked back to the barn bunk that night feeling something he had not felt in a very long time settled. Even the incompleteness of it felt right, because it was real. Sunday came with clear skies and cold, bright air, and after breakfast, while Clara was absorbed in a book she had borrowed from the schoolteacher in town, Susan and Harlan sat at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee and negotiated new terms. He would stay on through winter, and the following year at $15 a month and full board. He would have a formal interest in the work product of the farm, not in the land itself, not yet, but in the fruits of what they built together, which would be held in an informal account and could be used toward a future land purchase. They agreed that decisions about the farm would be made jointly, with Susan having final say on matters of her own land, and that either party could dissolve the arrangement with 30 days' notice and no penalty. They also agreed that the 40 acres from Doyle would be pursued, with their combined savings and credit from the bank, and that the deed would reflect both of their names, held in equal partnership. It was the most Harlan had ever owned of anything. He signed the paper Susan had drafted in her clear, precise handwriting, and she signed beside his name, and they shook hands across the table with a formality that was somehow also its own kind of tenderness. "Welcome to the Dawson place," Susan said, and the dry humor in her voice was a newer thing that he had been watching emerge over the previous weeks, a warmth that she showed in small, careful amounts, as if she was testing the safety of the territory. "Thank you," he said. "I intend to take good care of it." The winter was hard, as Kansas winters were, but the farm was better prepared for it than it had been in previous years, and having 2 adults with complementary skills managing the place made a difference that was measurable in practical terms, and in something less measurable but equally real: the quality of the days themselves, the way the work felt shared rather than shouldered alone. Clara, who had been carefully watchful of Harlan through the first weeks, began to treat him in December with the easy confidence of a child who has decided that someone is trustworthy. She started asking him questions about horses, about Texas, about whether it was true that mountain lions could scream like women, which was something someone at school had told her, with the energetic curiosity of a 7-year-old who has discovered a new and interesting source of information. He answered her questions with the same seriousness he'd give an adult, which she clearly appreciated, and he taught her to properly halter her pony, a small gray animal named Midge, and how to check Midge's hooves for stones. Susan watched this from a distance that was carefully maintained at first, and then grew less maintained as the winter progressed. She did not say anything about it directly for a long time, and when she finally did, it was oblique. "She talks about you at school," Susan said one evening, not looking up from the mending she was working on. "Does she?" Harlan said from behind the almanac he was reading. "Her teacher asked me who the man at our place was. Clara had apparently told her entire class that we have a hand who knows everything about horses and once saw a mountain lion in Colorado." "I did see a mountain lion in Colorado," he said, "though I may have made it sound slightly more dramatic than it strictly was." "Of course you did," Susan said, and the warmth in her voice was no longer carefully rationed. It was simply there, open and genuine, and when he looked up from his almanac she was looking at him with an expression that she did not quickly compose back into neutrality. They looked at each other for a moment across the kitchen, in the lamplight and the quiet, with the wind pressing at the windows and Clara asleep down the hall. "Susan," Harlan said. "Yes," she said. "I think you know what I'd like to ask you." "I think I do," she said. "Will you let me ask it formally, or would you prefer to skip that part?" She was quiet for a moment, and then something in her that had been held carefully for a very long time, years, probably, simply let go. "You can ask it formally," she said quietly. "I think I'd like that." He set the almanac down and crossed the room and stood in front of her chair, and she looked up at him with eyes that were very bright and very clear and entirely unafraid. "I am not a wealthy man," he said, "and I can't promise everything will be easy because nothing in this life ever is, and you know that better than most. But I am a man who is absolutely certain about this one thing, which is that there is no one I'd rather build a life alongside than you. I respect you more than I've ever respected anyone I've known, and I love you, and I would consider it the greatest privilege of my life if you'd agree to marry me." She looked at him for a long, full moment, and the expression on her face was something he was going to carry with him for the rest of his life, open and moved and entirely certain. "Yes," she said, "I would like that very much." He took her hand, which was work-strong and warm, and held it, and she stood up from the chair, and they stood close together in the lamplight of the kitchen with the plains wind outside and the whole of the future ahead of them. And it was exactly right. They were married in March of 1879, at the small church in Caldwell, in a ceremony that was attended by the Prout family and the school teacher and Monroe from the saloon, who came in his Sunday suit and cried in a way he was clearly embarrassed about, and they were both too polite to acknowledge. And Clara, who stood beside her mother in a blue dress she had picked out herself and held her mother's hand on one side, and then, after a moment of thought, held Harlan's hand on the other side, which made Susan press her lips together very hard against something that was threatening to become a sob. The minister was a direct man named Adler who had been marrying and burying people on the Kansas plains for 15 years and had a gift for brevity. The ceremony was simple and honest, and when Harlan and Susan exchanged the words that had been said over 1,000 years of human pairing, to love and to hold, in sickness and in health, for as long as they both should live, they said them looking at each other with the kind of steadiness that comes from having chosen each other with open eyes, without illusion or desperation, from a place of genuine knowledge of what the other person was. The reception was held at the Prout farm, which was larger than the Dawson place and better suited to gathering people, and there was food that half the county had contributed to and fiddle music that was energetic if occasionally slightly out of tune. And Harlan danced with Susan for the first time, discovering that she was a better dancer than her practical exterior had suggested, light on her feet, and with a natural sense of rhythm that she seemed faintly surprised he was keeping up with. "You can dance," she said with some genuine astonishment. "Texas," he said, as if that explained everything. "Does Texas teach all its cowboys to dance?" "Only the ones with good sense," he said, and she laughed a full laugh, unguarded, the kind that transformed her face and made Monroe cry again from across the room. Spring arrived with the particular urgency that Kansas springs had, the land shaking off winter fast and demanding immediate attention. The planting season of 1879 was the first they managed together from the beginning, planning the crop rotation together the previous winter, making decisions jointly about what to plant on which fields, accounting for what they had learned from the previous season's yield. Harlan's cattle management transformed the herd's productivity, and by early summer it was clear they were going to have a very good year. The Doyle land had been purchased in January, the deed registered at the county courthouse in both their names. It was not much 40 acres of short grass prairie that needed significant work before it would be truly productive, but it was theirs, and Harlan spent mornings working it in addition to his work on the main farm, and the sense of personal investment it gave him was something that he felt in his body, a kind of groundedness that he had not known he was missing until it was present. In May, Susan told him she was expecting. She told him early in the morning, before Clara was up, standing in the kitchen with her hands wrapped around her coffee cup and a directness in her face that was pure Susan. She never buried significant information in qualifiers or approaches. She said it plainly and then looked at him the way she always looked at him when she was saying something important, watching his face, not hiding from whatever was there. What was there was joy. Simple, unambiguous joy, and then immediately a concern that he needed to voice. "Are you well?" he asked. "Is everything all right with you?" "I feel terrible in the mornings," she said, "but that's expected and it's already improving. The doctor in Caldwell says everything is proceeding normally." "You've seen the doctor?" "I had to be sure first," she said, "before I said anything to you." He crossed the kitchen and held her, and she let herself be held, really let herself be held, which she did not always do easily, but which she had been learning over these months of marriage to allow without bracing against it. Her head was against his shoulder and her hands were pressed flat against his chest, and he thought that if the world ended in that moment he would have no cause for complaint. "I'm glad," he said quietly. "I'm so glad." "I thought you might be," she said, and he could hear the smile in her voice. Clara, when they told her, was silent for a suspicious amount of time, and then asked a series of highly practical questions about sleeping arrangements, feeding, and whether the baby would be allowed to touch her rag doll, which had a very specific policy around it that was not to be negotiated by anyone, including new family members. They assured her on all 3 points, and she went back to her breakfast with the satisfied air of someone who had obtained the information she needed. That summer was one of the best of Harlan's life. The crops came in well and the cattle prices held, and the farm took on a steadiness and productivity that turned into something like ease, not laziness. Nothing so casual as that, but the ease of a well-functioning system, of 2 people who knew each other's working rhythms well enough that the efficiency between them was natural. They argued sometimes. Susan was not a passive person and neither was Harlan, and there were genuine disagreements about methods and timing and money, but they argued directly and resolved things directly, and neither of them held on to things past their natural resolution. Neighbors took note. The Pruitts commented on it. Even Monroe, who came out to the farm once in July to return a borrowed tool and stayed for dinner, said afterward in town that the Rourke place had an air about it, which was his way of saying that it was a place where 2 people were genuinely happy, which was not as common a thing as it should have been on the frontier. In August, a man came through Caldwell who changed the nature of the situation with the Jarvis brothers and the Texas cattle operations grazing dispute. His name was Aldridge. He was a lawyer from Topeka, and he was representing the large Texas cattle operation, a company called the Meridian Cattle Company, in their claim to the unfenced grazing land on the northern flats. The claim was that the land had been used by Meridian cattle for 4 years prior to the Homestead Act claims in the area, and that this constituted a prior usage right that overrode the homestead patents. This was not a direct threat to the Dawson Rourke farm, which was on the eastern flats and not near the disputed northern land. But it was a threat to the Jarvis brothers and 2 other homestead families, and it was a threat to the principle that homestead patents meant what they said they meant, and Susan took an interest in it that was both principled and practical. She attended the county meeting where Aldridge presented the Meridian claim, sitting in the back of the crowded room with Harlan beside her and listening with complete attention. She asked 3 questions during the open floor period, questions that were so precisely targeted at the weak points in Aldridge's legal argument that the room went quiet each time she spoke, and Aldridge had to pause and regroup. Afterward, outside the meeting hall, one of the Jarvis brothers, a stocky, sunburned man named Cal, came over to her and said, with considerable feeling, "Mrs. Rourke, I want you to know that those questions you asked in there gave that Topeka lawyer more trouble than anything he heard from anyone else all evening." "The argument has a significant flaw," Susan said. "Prior usage by cattle doesn't establish a legal claim to land that was subsequently patented under the Homestead Act. The Supreme Court addressed a directly analogous situation in 1873. If the Jarvis family wants to pursue this legally rather than settling, I think there's a strong case to be made." Cal Jarvis stared at her. "How do you know that?" "I read," she said pleasantly. Harlan said nothing, but the pride in his chest was a physical thing, warm and expansive. He had known from early on that Susan was exceptional, but watching her deploy that intelligence in the service of justice, publicly and without apology, in a room full of men who were surprised to hear it from a woman, that was something he found entirely and deeply wonderful. The Jarvis case did eventually go to the county court, and the judge, reviewing the legal precedents that Susan had written out in a 3-page document that she provided to the Jarvis family's attorney, ruled against the Meridian Cattle Company's claim. The homestead patents held. Aldridge left Caldwell with considerably less than he had arrived with, and the Jarvis brothers held a small celebration that the surrounding homestead families attended, and Cal Jarvis gave a toast that specifically named Susan Rourke as having made the difference, and Susan received this in her usual manner, acknowledging it honestly without deflection, which was exactly as gracious as false modesty would have been ungracious. On a night in late October, a few days before the first anniversary of their marriage negotiation, though Susan always clarified that the official anniversary was the wedding, not the negotiation, and Harlan always said he thought both were worth marking, their son was born. The labor was long and difficult, and Harlan spent the duration of it in the kitchen drinking cold coffee and fielding Clara's questions, which ranged from the practical to the metaphysical, and thanking everything he had ever been grateful for when the doctor came out and told him that Susan and the baby were both well. The baby was a boy. He was 8 pounds, with Harlan's dark hair and Susan's particular intensity of expression. He arrived looking at the world with complete skepticism, which Susan said was either evidence of intelligence or extreme caution, and she considered both acceptable qualities. They named him James Thomas Rourke, James for Harlan's father, Thomas for Clara's father, because Susan had said, very simply, that she wanted her first husband to be remembered in the family they were building, and Harlan had felt the rightness of that immediately. Clara came to see her new brother with the careful, serious air of someone attending an important assessment. She looked at him for a long time and then she said, "He's very small." "He'll grow," Susan told her. "He looks annoyed," Clara said. "He'll get over that too," Harlan said, and Clara gave him a look that suggested she was not entirely convinced. The winter of 1879 into 1880 was spent differently than the previous one, with a new baby, and all the particular adjustments that entailed. With Clara at 6 months past 8 years old growing into a person of increasing capability and independence, and with the farm continuing to expand its production in ways that were beginning to feel less like survival and more like prosperity. Harlan finished fencing the 40 Doyle acres that winter, a job he had been working on in pieces since the previous spring. When the last post was set and the last wire was strung, on a cold, clear January day with his breath clouding in the air, he stood at the far corner of the property and looked back toward the main house, visible half a mile away as a dark shape against the white plain, and felt something settle in him so completely that it was almost physical, like a bone that had been out of joint being set back into place. This was his. This was the thing he had been moving toward for all those years of moving. Not just the land was the symbol of it, the concrete expression of it, but the wholeness of it, the life that had coalesced out of all those years of searching. He walked back to the house through the snow, and Susan was in the kitchen with James on her hip and a pot on the stove, and she looked up when he came in and read something in his face immediately. "You finished it," she said. "All fenced." She shifted James to her other hip and looked at Harlan with an expression that was so entirely warm and knowing and present that he had to stop walking for a moment just to absorb it. "How does it feel?" she asked. "Like something I never want to take for granted," he said. She crossed the kitchen and kissed him briefly, warmly, with James between them regarding the entire proceedings with his usual skeptical attention. In the spring of 1880, a new family arrived on the land to the north of the Dawson Rourke farm. A couple named Henderson with 4 children and no clear idea of what they were doing, which was a common enough condition for new homesteaders, and one that Susan and Harlan recognized from their own early experiences. They helped the Hendersons get established with the particular generosity of people who know what it costs to go without help when you need it, and a friendship developed between the two households that would serve both of them for years. The Henderson wife, a woman named Grace who was from Illinois and had her husband's optimism without his occasional impracticality, became Susan's closest friend in the county. The first real friendship. Susan told Harlan one evening that she had allowed herself since Thomas died. "I pulled back from people after he was gone," she said. "It felt safer. And then I had enough to do that I didn't notice the absence of it mostly. And now," Harlan said. "And now I notice the presence of it," she said, and smiled. The summer of 1880 was hot and dry, and the crops needed careful management. Harlan spent long days directing the irrigation channels they had dug the previous spring, and Susan managed the cattle side with the help of a young hired hand they had taken on in April, a 17-year-old named Silas from a broken-up family on the western edge of the county who was good with animals and needed the work. They paid him fairly, which was not universal in the area, and fed him well, which he clearly needed. And over the course of the summer, he became part of the household in the way that useful, earnest young people sometimes do. In the fall, Clara started a higher level of schooling in town. The schoolteacher, a Miss Ellerby, had identified her as exceptional and was pushing her beyond the standard curriculum, towards subjects that would normally not have been considered necessary for a farm girl in rural Kansas in 1880. Susan supported this with the complete and uncomplicated conviction that her daughter's intelligence was an asset to be developed rather than managed. Harlan took Clara into town on those school days, a 4-mile ride that she used to ask questions about everything they passed: the behavior of the horses, the geology of the river bank, the migration patterns of the birds they saw in the fall sky. He answered what he could and was honest about what he didn't know, which she seemed to appreciate more than the answers themselves. "Do you think I could study law?" she asked him one morning on the road to town with the October sky enormous and blue above them. He considered the question seriously. "I think you could study whatever you set your mind to. Law specifically, that's going to be harder for you to access than it would be for a boy, and I won't pretend otherwise. But the world changes, Clara. Not as fast as it should, but it changes. Mama says the world changes when people make it change," Clara said. "Your mama is correct about that," Harlan said, "and about most things, so it's worth paying attention." Clara seemed satisfied with this, and they rode the rest of the way into town with the easy quiet of two people who are comfortable with each other. The winter of 1880 brought news from the eastern states that the political and legal landscape around land rights was shifting further, and that the pressure on homesteaders from large commercial cattle operations was not going away. Susan and Harlan attended every county meeting, read the newspapers that came through Caldwell, and wrote 2 letters to their state representatives. One about homestead patent protections, and one about water rights along the river that crossed their eastern boundary, which had been in informal dispute with a neighboring operation for the better part of a year. The water rights issue resolved in their favor in the spring of 1881 through a negotiated agreement with the neighbor that was largely structured by Susan, who had become known in the county as someone you wanted on your side when a complicated agreement needed to be written. She did this without any formal legal training, with nothing but her intelligence and her reading and her absolute refusal to be intimidated, and Harlan watched it happen with a pride that was beyond what he had words for and that he tried to express in the smaller currencies available to him. The extra cup of coffee, the good morning that told her he had seen her, the way he sometimes just looked at her across a room with everything he felt entirely visible on his face. Susan had told him once in the early months of their marriage that she was not a woman who needed constant reassurance. "I know what I'm worth," she had said, matter-of-factly. "I don't need you to keep telling me." But she had also said in the same conversation that the way he looked at her, as if she was exactly what he had been looking for, was something she valued in a way she found hard to articulate. "It's not flattery," she had said. "It's more like recognition. You see me as I am, not as something easier or simpler, and that matters." "You are exactly what I was looking for," he had said. "I just didn't know what to call it until I found it." James turned 2 in October of 1881. A milestone that Clara marked with a birthday cake she helped Susan bake, and a gift she had made herself, a small wooden horse that Silas had helped her carve over several evenings in the barn, painted with the kind of concentrated care that was very Clara. James received this horse with the solemn appreciation of a 2-year-old who understood that something significant had been given. In December of that year, Susan told Harlan she was expecting again. This time she told him in the evening, with the same directness she always had, and this time he laughed out of joy, spontaneous and unguarded, and she laughed too, which was still something that knocked him slightly sideways every time it happened, because it was so full and so rare and so entirely given without condition. The second child arrived in late July of 1882, on a hot summer night with the windows open, and the sound of the Kansas plains coming in on the warm air. It was a girl, 7 pounds, with Harlan's gray-blue eyes and a quantity of hair that the midwife said was remarkable. Susan was tired but bright-eyed when Harlan came in, and she held the baby in the particular way that she held all things of great importance, not with white-knuckled protectiveness but with a sure and quiet confidence. "She looks like you," Susan said. "She's better looking than me," he said. "That's not difficult," Susan said, and then saw his expression and added, "I mean that affectionately." "I know you do," he said, and kissed her forehead and looked at his daughter. They named her Margaret Ann Rourke, after Susan's mother, who had died when Susan was 12, and who Susan had spoken of several times in the years of their marriage with a particular kind of love that was made up almost entirely of the question of who she might have been to her. It was the kind of naming that meant something beyond the practical, and Harlan understood that. Clara, now 11, took to Margaret with an older sibling's particular combination of authority and tenderness. She had James at 3 well trained in the art of not touching certain things and following certain rules, and she applied the same curriculum to Margaret with the organized affection of a small-scale administrator. Life on the farm continued to build and accumulate in the way that good lives do, not dramatically mostly, but with the steady layering of events and seasons and growth that eventually adds up to something undeniable. By 1883, they had expanded the herd to 50 head, had added a small dairy operation, and had purchased an additional 20 acres to the east when an elderly homesteader named Greer finally gave up the fight and returned to his family in Missouri. The farm was now over 200 acres, a significant holding by the standards of the county, and it was productive and well-run, and employed 3 additional hands besides Silas, who was now 20 and had become Harlan's right hand in the practical management of the cattle. Susan had also begun, quietly and without fanfare, to help other homesteaders in the county with their legal and administrative paperwork, leases, agreements, disputes with merchants, and larger operations. She charged nothing for this, which Grace Henderson said was either extremely generous or extremely impractical, and Susan said it was both, and she was fine with that. The reputation this built for her in the county was considerable, and it led, in 1883, to a formal request from the county commissioners for her to serve on an advisory panel for homesteader land rights, the first woman asked to serve in any such capacity in the county's history. She told Harlan about this on the evening the letter arrived, sitting at the kitchen table with the letter open in front of her, and her expression was carefully controlled, but her hands were not quite still. "You should do it," he said before she could say anything else. "I know," she said. I just wanted to tell you. You don't need to ask me." "I know I don't," she said. "I'm not asking. I'm telling you there's a difference." "Yes," he said, "there is, and I'm glad you told me." She looked at him across the table, with the lamp between them and the house quiet except for the small sleeping sounds of 2 children down the hall and the distant sound of James talking to himself in his bed, which he did every night and which they both found inexplicably comforting. "Harlan," she said. "Yes. Do you know what I thought when you first rode up?" He considered this. "You thought I was probably too confident for my own good and possibly for yours." She smiled. "I thought you looked like a man who was looking for something specific and was fairly certain he was going to find it." "That's an accurate read. I thought it would be useful to have someone like that around," she said, "but I did not think it would turn out to be like this." "Like what?" he said. She considered the question with the care she always gave to things she wanted to say exactly right. "Like a partnership that is also the best part of my life," she said. "I had not thought those 2 things could occupy the same space." He reached across the table and took her hand, and she looked at him with that particular look, the one that had been his since the evening in the kitchen, the one that he still sometimes could not fully believe was real. "I'm glad they can," he said. "So am I," she said. The years that followed were full in the way that good lives in that time, and place were full with work and seasons, and children growing and small crises managed, and large joys accumulated. Clara finished her formal schooling in Caldwell in 1885 and began studying on her own, with books ordered from as far as Chicago, determined in a way that neither of her parents would have tried to moderate even if they had wanted to. James grew into a boy who was his mother's intelligence and his father's ease with physical work in perfect combination, and who could be found at 9 years old either deep in a borrowed book or helping Silas manage the cattle, whichever the moment required. Margaret was bright and opinionated, and had a quality of dramatic expressiveness that Harlan said came from some ancestor he had no knowledge of, and Susan said with a perfectly straight face that she had absolutely no idea what he was talking about. In the spring of 1887, Susan was asked to testify before the state legislature in Topeka on the subject of homesteader water rights, a testimony she prepared for with 6 weeks of reading and writing, producing a document that Harlan, who read every word of it, thought was as clear and forceful and well-reasoned as anything written by anyone with formal legal training. He told her so, and she received the compliment as she received all things directly, without deflection, saying thank you in a way that meant it. She went to Topeka for 4 days, the first time she had been more than 20 miles from the farm in nearly a decade. She came back with the particular expression of a person who has done something difficult and done it well and knows it, and she told him that the testimony had gone well, that the committee had asked careful follow-up questions, and that 2 state senators had shaken her hand afterward and said she had given them things to think about that they would act on. "The world changes when people make it change," Harlan said. She looked at him sharply and then recognized what he was doing, and the smile that came was slow and real and entirely his. "Clara said that," she said. "Clara said it because you said it first," he told her. Summer of 1887 brought a drought that tested everything they had built. The rains that should have come in June and July came instead as sporadic, insufficient gestures from a sky that was otherwise mercilessly clear. The wheat suffered. The corn suffered more. The kitchen garden required daily bucket irrigation from the well, which was dropping faster than anyone in the county had seen before. Harlan spent those months making decisions that were difficult but careful, culling the herd to preserve the grass, drawing down on the savings they had built over the better part of a decade to purchase feed and supplement the cattle through the worst of it. Susan managed the household budget with a discipline that was both impressive and, he thought, probably somewhat painful for her, given how hard they had worked to build the cushion that was now being spent down. They held each other in those months differently than they held each other in the good seasons, not with less warmth, but with a different quality to it, something tighter and more present, the way people hold on to things they have learned the value of. The Henderson family, whose reserves were thinner, came close to losing everything. Susan organized a coordinated effort among the neighboring homesteads to share resources, a sharing of feed stock, a rotating labor pool for the most critical irrigation work, a collective purchasing agreement with the grain merchant in Caldwell that got them a better price than any of them could have managed individually. Harlan was the primary organizer of the physical labor side of it, and he did it with the same quality of presence he brought to everything completely, without reservation, without keeping track of what was owed. When the rains finally came in September, early and generous, with the particular extravagance that seemed designed to apologize for the summer, the relief that moved through the community was palpable. Not everyone had survived the drought fully intact. One family had sold and left, and the Whitfield farm had debts that would take years to clear, but most had come through, and the coming through had been a collective thing, which made it mean something more than mere survival. After the first good rain, when the sky had cleared and the evening was cool and smelled of wet grass and earth, Harlan and Susan stood on the porch of the house and looked at their land in the last light. The grass was already lifting, already responding to the water with a greenness that had been absent for months. The cattle were grazing in the far pasture. James and Margaret were chasing fireflies in the yard. Clara was inside reading, because Clara was always inside reading, which was as it should be. Susan leaned against Harlan and he put his arm around her, and they stood there in the quiet of the evening with everything they had built around them and between them, and it was so much more than either of them had started with that it was sometimes still hard to take in. "I've been thinking," Susan said. "About what? Clara is going to go east," she said. "For school eventually. I think she has to. There's nothing here that can contain what she is." "I know," he said. "I've been thinking that too." "It's going to be strange," she said, "having her gone. It will, but she'll come back to visit and we'll be fine and she'll become whatever she's meant to become. Which is going to be something considerable. She gets that from you too, you know," Susan said, "not just from me." "She gets it from herself," Harlan said. "We just didn't get in the way." Susan was quiet for a moment and then she turned slightly and looked up at him. "Are you happy?" she asked. It was a direct question, asked with the particular directness she reserved for things she actually needed to know. He looked down at her, at the face he had been looking at for nearly 10 years and which continued to be, to him, the most interesting face he had ever seen, not because it was beautiful, though it was, in the particular way of faces that are made interesting by the people living behind them, but because there was so much in it, so much intelligence and honesty and capacity and humor, and the occasional carefully managed vulnerability. And because it was turned toward him with a trust that he had never taken for granted and never intended to. "Completely," he said, "in a way I didn't know was available." She held his gaze for a moment, and then she turned back to the plain, to the evening light on the wet grass, to the sound of their children laughing, and she took his hand where it rested on her shoulder and held it. "Good," she said. "Me too." The autumn of 1887 recovered well from the drought, and the partial harvest, combined with the careful management they had done over the summer, was enough to see them through the winter comfortably. The cattle herd rebuilt. The savings, reduced but not depleted, began to grow again. In January of 1888, Clara received a letter from a women's educational institution in Chicago, the Chicago Normal School, that her application had been accepted with a partial scholarship. She brought the letter to the kitchen table at breakfast and set it in front of her mother and Harlan, with a formality that was actually just a thin cover for the excitement that was visible in every part of her. Susan read the letter twice and then passed it to Harlan, and then stood up and hugged her daughter with a completeness that was unusual for her. Not the brief, efficient hug of a woman who shows affection in practical ways, but a full, held thing that lasted. "I knew," Susan said when she stepped back. "I always knew." "I had help," Clara said, looking at both of them. "I want you to know I know that." "You did the work," Harlan said. "I did the work because you made it possible for me to do the work," Clara said, with the precision of a person who intends to be exact. "Those are different things." Harlan looked at her, this young woman of 17 who had arrived in his life as a 7-year-old asking about horses and mountain lions, who had grown into someone who was going to do things that none of them could fully predict yet, and felt a love for her that was its own particular category, a thing that had no name but was entirely real. "We are very proud of you," he said, and meant it in the deepest way he had. Clara left for Chicago in September of 1888, and the house was quieter after that in ways that were sometimes hard and sometimes simply peaceful, because that was the nature of children going to live their own lives, and it was the right kind of loss. James, who was 8, and Margaret, who was 6, absorbed the additional attention of two parents whose energies were somewhat redirected by Clara's departure, and both of them expanded into it with the generosity of children who had always been loved well. By 1890, the farm was one of the most established in the county, and Susan and Harlan had a place in the community that was built not on wealth, though they were comfortable, but on something more valuable: the knowledge that they were people who could be relied upon, who would show up when things went wrong, who would share what they had and bring their best thinking to any problem that needed solving. The 1890s brought new challenges to the plains. The economic depression of 1893 hit the agricultural communities of Kansas hard, with falling crop prices and tight credit that forced many families off their land. Susan and Harlan navigated this with the same combination of careful management and community-mindedness they had brought to the drought, pulling in, spending less, helping neighbors in the ways available to them, maintaining the essentials and letting the peripherals go. They lost some of what they had built in that decade and gained some of it back, and by the time the worst of it was over, they were still standing on their land with their children and their work and each other, which was what mattered. Clara came back from Chicago in 1892 with a teaching certificate and a quality of settled purpose about her that Susan recognized as her own quality reflected back through a generation. She taught in Caldwell for a year, and then moved to a larger town in western Kansas where the work was more demanding, and where she eventually met a man, a lawyer, which Clara said was too predictable, and which Susan said was exactly right, and built a life that was her own in all the ways that mattered. She wrote letters home every 2 weeks without fail, long, detailed, intelligent letters that Susan read at the kitchen table and passed to Harlan, who read them with the particular pleasure of someone whose affection for the writer has never diminished and never will. James, growing into a young man with his parents' joint stubbornness and his own considerable warmth, stayed on the farm through his teens, took on increasing responsibility with the cattle, and became, by the time he was 18, something very close to a partner in the operation in the practical sense, which was more or less what Harlan had been at the same age in spirit, if not in formal recognition. Margaret, at 12 and then 15, was a force of nature that even her parents regarded with something like awe, opinionated, capable, deeply funny in the way her father was funny, and with a quality of practical boldness that was very much her mother's. She drove the farm wagon to town alone from age 13, kept her own accounts for the dairy operation she had taken over managing at 14, and announced at 16 that she intended to become a doctor, which Susan received without blinking, and Harlan said he entirely believed. In the spring of 1895, Harlan and Susan sat on the porch of the house they had been expanding and improving for 15 years. A house that now had a proper parlor and a second story and a porch that wrapped around two sides, built in stages as money allowed, and watched the afternoon light move across the plains that had been theirs for all of that time. James was managing the east pasture. Margaret was at school in town. The farm was solid and established and running with a rhythm that was almost a living thing, breathing in and out with the seasons. Monroe died, Susan said, not abruptly, but in the way she delivered difficult information plainly without building to it unnecessarily. She had heard from Grace Henderson, who had it from someone in town. The old barkeep had gone quietly in his sleep, which was a decent way to go. He was a good man, Harlan said, in his particular way. He cried at our wedding, Susan said. He'd be embarrassed to know we remembered that. He told me once when I ran into him in town about a year after we married that he had not thought you would last the winter, she said. He meant on the farm. He thought I'd turn you away after the trial period. And when you didn't, he said he was glad to have been wrong, she said, and that he had told you I was the kind of woman who would outlast any man who came looking. He did say that, Harlan said, exact words, and you went looking anyway. I went looking because of it, he said. I told him that was exactly the kind of woman I'd been looking for. She looked at him sideways with that particular expression, the one that had been his for nearly 20 years that still made him feel as seen and as known as anything he had ever experienced. Were you serious, she asked, when you said that to him? Completely, he said. I was tired of easy things. Easy things don't last, and I wanted something that would last. I wanted someone who would outlast me, frankly. Someone whose roots were deeper than mine and whose sense of what she was building was clearer than anyone I'd known. And do you think I will, she said, outlast you? I hope so, he said simply. It would comfort me, the thought of you still here when I'm not. Still running things, still making things better. She was quiet for a moment. That's a strange kind of comfort. It's an honest one, he said. I love this place and I love you and I love what we built here. The idea of you carrying it forward rather than it ending, yes, that comforts me. She looked out at the plain for a moment and then back at him. I don't intend to be left behind, she said with the dry humor that was so entirely hers. For the record. No, he agreed. I know you don't. But, she said, and paused, and then said the thing she had perhaps been carrying for a while, I know what you mean. The first years after Thomas being here without him, I understood how much of himself he had put into this place. And that feeling of tending something that was partly someone else's also, it was not a burden. It was a kind of continuation, a conversation that doesn't have to end just because the other person is gone. Harlan looked at her for a long moment. You've never said it quite like that before. I've thought it for years, she said. I think I needed enough years to have the words for it. We should have more years for more words, he said. We should, she agreed, with a quiet certainty that was the best thing he had heard in a very long time, and it was a very good list. The afternoon light moved across the Kansas plains in its slow, enormous way, turning the grass gold and the sky that particular shade of blue that made the whole world look like something out of a painting that no one alive could quite manage to replicate. The farm breathed around them. Somewhere in the east pasture, James was calling to the cattle in the easy, carrying voice he had developed from watching Harlan do the same thing since he was 4 years old. A hawk was describing slow circles over the far fence line. The wind moved through the grass in long, whispering waves. Harlan Rourke took his wife's hand, and Susan Rourke held it, and they sat together on the porch of the house they had built with years of work and honesty and love, on the land that was theirs in every sense that mattered, in the life that had grown from the most practical of beginnings into the most essential of things. He had ridden into Caldwell with $43 and a lame horse and a barkeep's warning ringing in his ears, and he had said, with the quiet certainty of a man who knows what he is looking for, that that was exactly the kind of woman he had been searching for. He had been right. And the fact that he had been right, that she had been real, and had said yes, and had built this with him, all of it, the years and the seasons and the children and the arguments and the droughts and the celebrations, all of the real and complete substance of an actual life. That was the thing he was most grateful for in the world. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything, because there was nothing to say that wasn't already present in the afternoon light, and the sound of the plains and the feel of her hand in his, solid and warm and utterly certain, the same way it had been when he first held it across a kitchen table in the lamplight of an autumn evening, and the same way he intended for it to be for every year of every season that remained to them. The hawk made one more circle and was gone, and the grass kept moving the way it always had and always would, and the sky over Kansas went on being exactly as enormous and clear and indifferent as it had always been, and none of that touched them at all.